right, well, let's talk about containers this morning. Well, okay, I'm sitting here. I've got my containers fixed up for the spring. And I know they're not all in the shop. There's 8 here altogether. The first 2 are carrots. I like growing carrots in these 5-gallon buckets because it's easy to know you've got this much soil that's all loose and there's no stones and there's no reason that carrot can't extend. And I have had them grow all the way to the bottom of that 5-gallon bucket. The second 2 are my lettuce. The lettuces are fun to grow in a bucket. I just plant them thick and it's cut and come again. You know, I don't worry about overcrowding because I'm just taking leaves. You know, I'm not taking out the whole plant. So I found that a couple of buckets, a couple of 5-gallon buckets is enough lettuce for my wife and I. Because that's usually, you know, they'll get grown up, get big, you'll cut them. That's enough for a couple of different salads. And a week or so later, they've grown right back again. So that's plenty. Then I've got 2 here that are sugar snap peas. And that's what I'm using the old wire tomato cages for. Those things that aren't worth a darn to try to grow a tomato in, they're good for sugar snap peas. The sugar snap peas aren't great climbers. They're not great at holding on to a trellis or anything. But if you plant a clump of them, and you can put 6 or 8 of them in a 5-gallon bucket, they don't mind being crowded. And just put them right in the middle, and they'll hold on to each other just fine. And they'll grow up, and this is just enough to hold on to them, keep that stack, that mess going more or less upright. And then the last 2, I've planted Swiss chard in the middle. I put 2 or 3 seeds right in the middle of each one of those buckets, and I'll thin them. But what I'm going to do this morning is I was going to take some of my leftover radish seed and just take a few of them and put them around the edges of those buckets that the Swiss chard is in, because there'll be enough room. There'll be enough room, and the time the Swiss chard needs the rest of the bucket, they'll be grown and out of it. All right. Now, that concludes the bucket experience for this morning. But you should consider, most gardeners have a few containers, and there's good reason for that. First of all, you know, I keep my garden all mulched. Sometimes it's handy to be able to, little stuff like lettuce, to just plant them in a container off to the side. It's easy to take care of. Just throw a little water at them every day or two. 2 or 3 things on preparing the soil. Now, I take these once a year, one at a time. I'll dump them out in my bucket. And then I take a little small bucket, get into my rabbit manure pile, throw a new bucket of rabbit manure in, stir them up, put them back in the bucket. So every year, my number of buckets grows a little bit. You know, I started out with 6, and I have 8 this year, you know, because of adding the extra manure. Now, they'll settle a little bit after you've filled them up, but they work just fine, and they're easy. And that's kind of what makes it the fun thing. You know, carrots, kind of hard to grow in Kansas, but they grow great in the buckets. You know, lettuce grows okay, but, you know, it's just contained in those 5-gallon buckets makes it just seems to be just about right for us. So consider doing some containers. I don't know that I can tell you anything that maybe anybody else couldn't tell you about it, other than it's just always kind of fun to have a few containers on the side, and it's a little expansion room for your garden. You know, I've got 5 beds that are 16 foot long, 4 foot wide, and I get about 3 rows into each bed, which is quite a bit. But you know, by the time you have one bed, it's taken up with the tomato plants and squash I'm growing in there this year. You've got another bed that is going to be pretty much green beans. You've got a third one that's going to be pretty much corn, and then another one that's taken up by perennials. The asparagus at one end that I planted this spring, and I'm excited about seeing that one because that's a purple asparagus. So I'm curious how that's going to be. But it's asparagus at one end and it's the rhubarb at the other. So it's something that's a perennial. I'm not planting crop. So the buckets are the extra expansion room. The little spot where, hey, I'm going to plant a little bit of this or a little bit of that just to see what it does, just for fun or just because I want a little bit. In the case of sugar snap peas, for instance, my wife doesn't like them. She won't eat them. Doesn't peas nasty, she says. I like them. Okay? So I can plant me a couple of buckets, and that's enough for me to get a couple of tastes through the year. And, you know, I don't have to worry about it. Now, I realize a lot of people don't have rabbit manure. That's okay. Use compost. Go buy a bag of compost. You know, put a little bit on each bucket, you know, every year. Go ahead and grow. It's helpful if you can dump them out and kind of stir it up. But now, one thing I do want to say, if you're going to use a fertilizer, you know, let's say my soil's still pretty good this year, but I want to do some fertilizer. Put the fertilizer all in the top third of the bucket. Don't worry about getting it all the way to the bottom. Because think about it, this is a container. You're going to water it about every day through the summer because it's going to be hot and they're going to dry out fast. So about every day you're going to come along here to the watering can, put a little water in each one of the buckets. Over the summer, most of that is going to trickle down to the bottom. It's going to be down in the bottom half. Okay, so later on in the summer, your crops that don't have deep root systems, like let's say the lettuce, it'll grow along, say about mid-June or so, it's going to get too hot, it's going to bolt. So I'm going to quit watering those and let them dry out and die. And then in August, I'm going to clean the buckets out, plant another crop of lettuce to have lettuce then through the fall. Well, you know, if I used chemical fertilizer and I mixed it all the way through that bucket, that second crop, there's probably not much left in the top third, and that's as far as the roots will go. So that's about the high point. If you don't have any containers, gosh, try. Find some. Use whatever you can use. I've got some that are repurposed from paint projects we've done around the house. I've got some that I purchased inexpensively, you know, and you can get them at restaurants sometimes. And there's things, sometimes you just come across something you've got and you say, hey, wait a minute. You know, that'd make a great container, you know, an old tote that you're not using for anything anymore or something like that. And you can just put a couple drain holes in it and go to using it. So, all right, I want you all to have a good day. And I want you all to consider doing little containers on the side.